Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the Audit, Risk and Assurance Committee. Everybody is very welcome, and I think we have a relatively short agenda today, so hopefully not a terribly long meeting, but for as long as it takes. We have with us as board members Grant McRae, Katrina Stewart and Katharina Casper. I'm Mary Pitt-Caithley and I'm chairing the meeting. But if I should drop out of the call for any reason, I'd ask if Grant could perhaps step in as to chair the meeting until I can get back on. Happy with that, Grant?
Yes.
Thank you very much. We have apologies today from Paul Eadie, and I think the only other thing would be to ask for any declarations of interest. I have none noted, but if anybody has anything. Nope. Thank you very much. So item 1.3 is the minute of the meeting that was held on the 6th of February this year. And I would invite members to approve this as an accurate record of the meeting. Okay, thank you very much. And the other preliminary matter is a decision on taking business in private, and that would be item 3, and that's simply the minute of the private part of that particular meeting. So in accordance with section 20 of the SPA standing orders, invite members to agree to take that agenda item 3 in private. Okay, thank you very much. So today we have 3 internal audit reports. Claire Robertson from BDO will be presenting each of the reports. I think, Claire, you've got a busy day today. And the first of these is in relation to electronic data retention and the interim vulnerable persons database. Claire, if you want to present the report, and then I'm going to ask ACC Beck Smith and ACC Alan Spears, who are both now DCCs. The date having passed, I think, would that be right? Yes. Apologies for that. Demoted you there. So ask them if they have, if they wish to answer any question or pick up any of the management points from that presentation. So Claire, over to you.
Thank you. So the data retention and interim vulnerable persons database review covers both general controls related to electronic file storage, destruction and retention, but also we undertook a targeted review of the interim vulnerable persons database, considering data issues around consent, communication, retention and destruction. You'll see that the conclusion is to provide limited assurance over the design and operational effectiveness of the high-level electronic retention and IBPD processes in place. We have noted within the report that the system does exhibit lots of areas of good practice that we'd expect relating to system process controls, quality assurance processes and audit trails, but we have raised a number of findings around general data retention practices. Some of the more important findings for us were the electronic retention mandatory training. The completion target is set at 80%, and we feel that mandatory training should be mandatory, and therefore a target of 100% for that would be more suitable and allow the police to demonstrate they're doing what they can to inform staff about their responsibilities regarding vulnerable persons data and therefore protect that data to the best of their ability. We have suggested that the target be moved to 100% and that access to the system, the IVPD system, for those who have not completed the training be restricted. Management don't agree with that point, feeling for operational reasons it is not suitable, but it is something that we think should be considered. Also, related to that point, there are no staff declarations confirming understanding of policies and procedures, particularly when those policies and procedures change. So taken together with the first point, we feel again it's reinforcing that we could do more to demonstrate that Police Scotland are doing what they can to enable staff to understand their responsibilities around data. We've also noted within the report weaknesses with user access review controls. There's no central oversight of who can access the database. Concern hubs in divisions manage the access and they can't evidence to us regular review of your user access rights. So the information governance team do send out a quarterly note of who has access, and the intention behind that is that the divisional hubs will then review whether all of that access is still required and take any actions, but they just can't evidence that control is actually in place and working. So we recommended improving there. We've also noted that there are third parties with whom concern reports can be shared where there's no information sharing agreements in place. So that exposes us to a risk around data sharing there too. And we've also raised some findings around administration of the policies and procedures, such as evidence and approvals, and highlighted an opportunity to enhance the information within the Seeking Views aid memoir to enhance the ability of officers to provide vulnerable people with information on their rights data-wise. There are a few areas where management have not fully accepted recommendations, as some I've mentioned already, and some where management have committed to alternate actions, and those are all explained in the management responses, but happy to take any questions if you have any on those.
Thank you very much, Claire. Just before I bring in the Bex and Alan, I wonder if we could pick up that last point you made there, Claire, about the decision, the recommendations which haven't been accepted by management or only partially accepted. And I think we recognise that management might not always accept every recommendation, but it's important that this committee and the authority is able to manage the risks that you're highlighting to us in these reports. And manage those risks within an acceptable level. So I think what I'd like to hear from Bex or Alan is an assurance that you have alternative mitigating measures or controls in place that address the risks that Claire has just identified. So hand over to Bex. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of points, if I may. So the recommendations that we haven't accepted are around the 100% compliance for training. It's just simply not feasible for us to be able to do that, unfortunately, with absence, turnover of staff, etc. I'm confident that the 80% is achievable, and that's what we will work towards to do in relation to that. There's a full update around that within the management recommendations. The other aspect of that is around access review limitations and a lack of central oversight of the general user access, which we've committed to since actually 2022, managing a link between Scope, the system that manages HR, and all of the records around the levels of user access, and that is ongoing, and that's in the work plan currently. It's just due to other priorities and resource that we haven't managed to complete that work, but it's something that we will do, absolutely. I suppose the third area that I wanted to comment on was information sharing agreements, and we know that that is an issue. We've got many information sharing agreements with different agencies, which is of course really important, and I've committed through the Risk and Harm Data Oversight Group just to review that and make sure we understand where the gaps are, and we're working to fill those. I know the team are already doing that work, it's underway, so it's helpful that the review has highlighted that as an area that we need to focus on and that we will do moving forward, perhaps just not as quickly as perhaps we would like in terms of being able to do that in the timescale provided, but hence the partially accepting the responsibilities in relation to those. Chair, if that helps.
Thank you very much. I don't know if Claire wants to come back on that before I open it up to board members.
I guess I might be repeating myself a little bit, but on the mandatory training point, I do think it is important to target 100% and to set the expectation that this training really is mandatory. And there's no kind of organisation really directly comparable to Police Scotland, but certainly within a number of different professional kind of organisations where they have risks around data, risks around cybersecurity or money laundering, 100% mandatory training is required, and access to systems such as containing vulnerable people's data is restricted if they've not completed that training until such time as they do complete it. So understand the concerns about the operational elements of it, but I think that's potentially a risk exposure too far. It's not for me to decide if that's within your risk appetite, but for me it seems like an exposure that could be further mitigated.
Okay, thank you, Claire. Any member of the board of the committee want to ask any questions? Grant, and then Katharina.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to home in particularly on the recommendation of information sharing agreement. I note what's been said and hoping to facilitate demonstrable legislative compliance during 2024. Basically, I think it would be helpful to have a target date against this. I appreciate how difficult maybe getting an agreement finalised will be, but it's a very sensitive, the sort of information is very sensitive, and I think being quite clear who can do what and when and how and what information can be exchanged is actually quite important. We don't want to sort of suddenly find ourselves exposed to something that has been allowed to be sort of shared with other parties when it shouldn't have been. So that I'm thinking in terms of getting an agreement in place and getting everybody from Police Scotland understanding clearly what they can and can't do is quite important. So a target date would be helpful.
Yes. Any comments on that from yourself, Bex?
So I think it's really important to stress that we have got information sharing agreements alongside many different agencies that we share with. This is it's really important that I get that point across. And I suppose from our perspective, and actually I went through the training on that myself this morning in terms of the information sharing. I wanted to see what we were giving our officers and staff around that. And it is really clear, Grant, around their responsibilities, the legislative, statutory measures that are in place around that particular element in terms of information sharing. Just in terms of the information sharing agreement, there is absolutely a review underway to have a look at where our gaps are. It was underway prior to this particular audit. We know that that's something that we need to work on, but I suppose just to reassure you, there are few as opposed to many, if that makes sense. So it's not something that we've got huge areas of concern around information sharing inappropriately, etc. So I suppose reassurance wise, absolutely that's underway. I suppose my reticence in giving you a target date that is nearer is just being able to hit that. I want to make sure we do it properly. You will have seen with the report and the amount of information that VPD has. We share quite rightly with many different agencies, really appropriately right across the system. And I suppose I want to make sure we do that properly. And it's not just within VPD, lots of different areas and information sharing agreements are in place. And I suppose making sure that we cover those is really important to me, and doing that appropriately through the portfolio in terms of risk and harm data is something that I'm really committed to. So I've set that target date to make sure that we do that in the right way.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I'm reassured the fact that there's quite a lot of clarity as to what can and can't be shared. I think if you understand why you feel it's difficult to come up with a precise date, so maybe but at the next Audit and Risk Committee meeting, you could give us an update as to where you are on that journey.
Yeah, I think that would be very useful. Thank you for that suggestion, Grant. I suppose it's not just a question of being careful about what is shared with other agencies, but about being sure that they use that information appropriately. So do you monitor that?
So we don't monitor, once we've shared information with that agency, we don't monitor what they do with that information. That information is then considered shared. I suppose what is important to note here, and perhaps in a corrective sense, is we share 60% of the information that we gather with other agencies, which shows, I suppose, just how important it is that we're able to contribute to that picture. And then some of that information will be used around interagency discussions, for example, around an individual or a particular case, where we would then be asked to share everything that we hold on the system to support that individual to be able to make a good decision around managing them and the risk, and making sure they're safeguarded appropriately. So I suppose from my perspective, we wouldn't be able to tell you what we did with that information, as in what the other agency did once we had shared it, if it was over to them and they were the most appropriate agency to continue that activity. What we would be able to do, though, however, is talk about the cases that we had dealt with jointly in terms of an individual where policing was involved in that. And actually, I've got some really good examples of where that's happened with different agencies like Assist, etc., where we've shared information appropriately, and then that individual has engaged with the system with an alternative third sector organisation, and actually been supported and safeguarded as a result of the information that we have shared as police to enable that interaction. So I suppose there are lots of case studies that I could go through with you in terms of just giving you that understanding of how important that information sharing is in terms of onward transmission. But it wouldn't be our responsibility to then assess the impact or the effectiveness of that information sharing once it's left us, if that makes sense in policing.
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you. Katharina, you wanted to come in?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Claire and the team, and to Police Scotland for obviously conducting this report. Really interesting. And I understand that the scope was not to look at the kind of proportionate use of the database, etc. But I suppose what I was just trying to kind of understand from this report, and maybe get a little bit more clarification from Claire, is it is on slide 11, I think, in my deck, where there is a box that kind of says, sorry, just a second, scrolling to that. So the box that their testing did not identify any concerns surrounding the controls in place to mitigate the following risks. And there is 3 risks listed there, and the middle one of them is around the quality of data within the IVPD is poor. So I understand you're not necessarily providing positive assurance here, Claire, but am I right in understanding that from what the work that you've done, you didn't pick up any data quality issues? And the reason I'm asking is because actually, some of the things where you do find, where you have made recommendations relating to training, relating to user access, etc., those are all those things that if they're not in place, there is likely to be a knock-on impact on data quality. So I suppose I'm just trying to be really, really clear around what is it that you can tell us, without necessarily providing positive assurance otherwise, around data quality, but particularly say considering the observations that you have made.
Yeah, I guess the ticks in these boxes do really indicate that we did testing in these areas and we found nothing to bring to your attention. So it really is positive assurance.
Good.
The reports are kind of by exception. So hopefully we've captured some of those areas in the good practice section. But yeah, we're just highlighting that we don't have any concerns in those areas.
That's really helpful. So just to be very clear, you didn't identify any issues with data quality as such. Okay,
No.
That's good. That's good. Thank you.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much. John, you wanted to come in.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to bring you back to the discussion we had on the training target recommendation. We have a position from Police Scotland to do with 100% completion, and they don't feel that that's appropriate. And I understand in their explanation, they talk about staff who are not available because of sickness or any other number of reasons. But again, we have BDO who are professional advisors here who have a different opinion. So we're left with a situation where we have 2 different thoughts on this matter, which we need to reach a conclusion whether we feel it's appropriate that any further action needs to be taken.
Okay. Yeah, the committee, I think, understands the feasibility issues that Beck's highlighted. It's always difficult to get 100% of anything, but with those particular issues that were highlighted, I can understand why there would be a reluctance to accept that recommendation. But perhaps 80% is on the low side. Alan, did you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. So obviously I've got responsibility for training and the oversight of our ability to focus on mandatory training. So probably a couple of observations that are probably maybe in the same space as where Bex has been. So when you look across local policing and into our business areas, for all different reasons, our average abstraction rate is somewhere around 27%. I would also suggest that IVPD isn't a system that routinely every officer in the force would use. So one, based on our average level of abstraction, 100% is literally impossible to achieve. But we have to take cognizance that there are a lot of business areas where officers wouldn't routinely be required to utilise IVPD. And so for both of those reasons, I think 80% is a very measured target. I reflect on some of our other elements of mandatory training, such as health and safety, GDPR, and where we do aspire to get to high level, we literally will never achieve that. So I think it's about trying to have a smart target in relation to training, and given just the demands that's placed on our officers now, in my mind, we don't want to train officers who have no requirement to use a system.
Thank you, Alan. Katharina, you wanted to come back?
Yes, I mean, I see Claire's got her hand up, so maybe Claire wants to just
Oh.
respond to this specifically, and I also have
Okay.
an observation on this as well.
Okay, Claire.
I guess wanted to make clear on reflecting on the point about some officers not needing to use the database, that our testing did identify users with access to the database who had not completed the training, and that's really what sort of furthered our concern about it. And also highlight that the recommendation is in two parts. It is to change the target or to remove access for those. So if there are officers who don't need access to the system, therefore don't need to do the training, then maybe the target stays as it is, but their access is removed. So that was it.
So it would be 100% of those who have access rights, not 100% of all of the officers. Yeah. Katharina.
I mean, Claire predictably said what I was going to say, very, very similar, that, you know, I think if generally, if the justification is that some officers don't need to use it, then why do they have access to it? Basically, exactly, Claire just said it better than I would have said it.
Okay. Grant, you want, oh, sorry.
It was actually just to reinforce the same point, Mary. I know that in other organisations, there are barriers to be able to use a system unless you've gone through the process. And there may be various ways of achieving that here without being too difficult to implement. And I know that, for example, a lot of things you get reminders of on the sort of training that we as board members are required to do, and we get prompts on a regular basis to be sure that we've actually completed them. So, and I think that there must be some mechanism that would make this properly manageable without being too burdensome.
Yeah, thank you, Grant. Yes, Alan.
Sorry, Mary, it was me.
You're sharing a microphone.
Yeah, it was just to say, I suppose to reassure you, I haven't done the training for VPD, and I tried to access the system today and I can't. It came up with a big banner saying that I wasn't able to access it, just in terms of that, which I thought was quite interesting. But I suppose that's really helpful around the training recommendation. So we will absolutely work towards removing access to those whose training has elapsed or they haven't got the appropriate training, and we will ensure that those people who have access, and it's right and proper that they have access, have the appropriate modular training. I know that work is absolutely underway in terms of public protection, but I suppose the 100% element isn't helpful around, actually that's not what we're asking. We're saying that people who have appropriate role-based access to VPD are trained appropriately, as opposed to the workforce, 100% of the workforce being trained in terms of VPD, if that makes sense. So I think there's a slight difference, and I'm happy to kind of work through the second one, if that helps.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Thank you, Bex. Claire, would that be closer to what you're looking for?
I think that mitigates the risk, but I guess I would question why it's called mandatory training if it's not mandatory. It was described to us as mandatory, and I think there's maybe just a point here about not calling something mandatory if it isn't, because it's sort of undermining the importance of completing training. And I suppose the general principle with data protection and with other regulation is, if something does go wrong, your best defence against any kind of sanction is to say that your policies and procedures were clear, you trained your staff effectively, you confirmed their understanding of the policies and procedures, so you did all you can, and that really mitigates the risk if something does go wrong. So I think, yeah, it does mitigate the risk, and I don't want to divert the conversation down a different path, but just that use of the word mandatory, if it isn't in fact mandatory for all officers, I would question.
No, mandatory for the officers who need access, I think we're saying now. So that's much clearer. Thank you. So everybody content with that particular point now? Good. I too should have thanked you, Claire, for the work that BDO has done on this audit. It's very, very helpful, and there are some really interesting findings. One of which jumped off the page at me, which is around the fact that there are 900,000 nominal records on the IVPD system, and that is clearly a very large percentage of the Scottish population. So That's a very interesting statistic. And I suppose sorry, Claire, did you want to come in and say something about that there?
No, sorry, I was just murmuring in agreement.
Yeah, sorry. So I suppose what I wanted to ask, I think it would be either Alan or Bex, about the policing purpose for somebody's records being added to the database and the value that you get from having that information. So I think, you know, we'd want clarity around that, if you could possibly help us with that, please.
Of course. I suppose a couple of points that are really important to make. Policing responds to vulnerability as well as crime as well, you know, and I think in Scotland, from my experience of that with our wellbeing duty, actually that's very different in terms of the way that policing in England and Wales would respond, is my sense. And it would be absolutely inappropriate for us to record any form of vulnerability or information in terms of that in any crime system or intelligence system. So we know we need a separate system to be able to record that, hence the creation of VPD. That information recording and sharing probably has its basis in BSHARD and many other inquiries around where policing has been criticised over many years for not sharing information appropriately, for agencies to be able to make good decisions in terms of safeguarding individuals. And I don't need to go into the amount of cases around that. So the principle of that is understanding how we record information appropriately around somebody's vulnerability or moment of crisis or difficulty or mental health issue, whatever that might well be. And then what we do with that information is really important. And we know that we have a duty in terms of how we record that information, and B, how we share that information. And we seek consent from an individual to share their information with another agency, whether that's a statutory agency or whether that is a third sector agency, dependent on the level of risk that that person is at. And actually, interestingly, as a result of some of this work, I've been through to reassure myself, I suppose, more than anything, that we do that in the most appropriate way possible, using the legislation in the right way, our statutory duty, responsibility, and that is explained appropriately to the individual, but also that our staff are trained appropriately to understand the importance of getting that right. There are different methods of recording that and different reasons why we would share information about an individual in terms of their vulnerability. But most of the time, that is a protective duty about supporting that individual and making sure they get the right help and support when it's needed. And often that isn't a policing duty, that will be another agency that will be able to support that individual. But the other point that's really important is to understand when people are at risk or in crisis, we will gain records of that individual on many different occasions. And we know that sometimes people sadly spend a long time in crisis, and we will build up a picture of that individual. And that's why you will see so many different records on the system. Just in relation to that, we brought in 2019 a system to be able to manage the way that the records are stored on the system, so that those that aren't needed and that have come to an end, or a case has been closed, or it wouldn't be appropriate to keep that information, are then taken off the system overnight, and that's done automatically. And just to give you an idea, on average, we lose around 375 records a night, which is appropriately done in terms of that. And people can, of course, request the information that we hold about them on the system, and we will do that through a subject access request. So the short answer is, it is a lot of records. But if you think in terms of policing contact, 80% of calls into our control centre are to do with non-crime incidents, that people will phone us because they need somebody to help them, and often that's policing, and we will go, we will respond, and we will record. And most of the time, you will find officers will have to record that on IDPD because of somebody's vulnerability or how they've presented, how unwell they are, and what support they might need. And that could be the NHS, it could be third sector, that could be a domestic abuse agency, whatever that might be. It's our responsibility to do that. That's why there seems to be such a huge amount on the system. I think it speaks to the type of calls that we go to. And I suppose I'm really happy at a different juncture to kind of talk you through. I think it would probably really help if that's something that would be good, is to talk you through the process for that, that people go through, the sort of thought process, the legislative process, the rationale they have to record on the system. You can't simply just record something. You've got to really think about why you're sharing that or why you aren't sharing that. And you have to record that rationale. It's there and it's recorded on the system for all to see. Bit of a long explanation. I'm sorry about that, Mary, but I just thought it would be helpful to get a bit of context.
No, it's extremely helpful, Bex. I mean, I think we understand the purpose of the databases to help keep people safe, particularly people who are vulnerable, to keep communities safe as well. So there's a clarity of purpose there. But I suppose, given the large number of people and the people coming in and out of the system, as you say, I think what would be helpful would be some understanding of how people find out that they're on the system and whether or not they can ask to come for their data to be removed.
So yes, they can ask to be removed, absolutely. And we don't seek somebody's consent to put them on the system. We seek their consent to share their information. The weeding policy and process that we have that's set out on our website, which is standard across all of our systems, explains the different levels of risk in terms of time that individual might be on the system or might be weeded. And in some cases it's very short, and in some cases it's longer, if that makes sense. So I suppose people can apply to come off the database, absolutely, but the sort of policy around the weeding of the system is quite clear, but it's also quite complex in terms of the reason that they're on the system in the first place, if that makes sense, dependent on the level of risk that they may face or support that they may need from other agencies.
Yeah, okay, that's very helpful. Any, Grant, you wanted to come in?
Yes, thanks, Mary. Bex, could I just sort of try and get this right in my own mind? People go onto the database perhaps because of a call to the call centre. They don't know that they're on the database, but you clearly got a very significant percentage of the total population on it at any time. So I wonder how practical it is to actually review a database containing this significant level of numbers of people, 900,000 or so. And nobody can really manage something like that size very easily. So I just wonder if you could just clarify a little bit more about, say somebody goes on at the call center database call, whatever, how long it takes for somebody to actually then say, is it appropriate to be on the database, or was that really there in error or whatever? It just seems a large database to manage effectively.
It is a large database to manage effectively, absolutely. But I think that the weeding and retention rules that we have that are set out give a really clear indication as to when somebody would come off the database or the reason for it. I suppose also a point that's really important to make, Grant, and you reference this, is sometimes when we are called to an individual who is in crisis, for example, we would deal with that individual and we would make a decision that it wouldn't be appropriate to seek their consent in that circumstance to be able to share their information, because actually we feel that they're at such great risk and they need support, whether that's NHS or whatever that might be, that we would make the decision to share that information because of a safeguarding need to be able to do that, a threat to life or however that might be. That's something that would override the ability for somebody to give us their consent. And you can probably think of a number of occasions where if somebody is suicidal or you know, we wouldn't sit there and seek their consent. That I suppose it's really important just to get that point across as well to you. But I think I would point to the SOP and the policy around retention and weeding, and it goes into a really high level of detail just in terms of the different categories that sit within the system and the timescales that we would weed those automatically, and it will give you a reassurance and clarity around that, so you can see how we've come up with that particular policy around that. But you're right, Grant, it is a lot of information to manage, but it's really important that we record vulnerability effectively. And I think with the new data weeding retention rules that we've put in place, I'm reassured that we're doing that appropriately.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I suppose the point is that there would be benefits potentially to the individual and to the public of someone's data being retained, but only for as long as is absolutely necessary, and not to be used, not to be shared without their consent, except in those few cases where you said that might be appropriate at the time. So I mean, I think your offer to go through that process of deciding who comes off, who stays on, would be very helpful. I think give us a better understanding of all of that. So probably take you up on that offer, Bex, and we'll do some deep dive or whatever on that whole process. Katharina, you wanted to come back in?
Yeah, thank you. No, and thank you very much, Bex, for the explanation. I think it's, again, really reassuring, I think, for everybody to kind of have that, have this conversation in the public space. I think Grant has probed a little bit on the, and we've all kind of probed on the size of the database, kind of and how it's all being managed. And I think, again, the weeding policies, etc., is really clear. And I think what is clear is that how you use the data in relation to each individual who's on there, because it will be obviously depending on the needs of the individual. So that I think that's very, very clear as well. I suppose with just one kind of thing that's still left in my mind, one question is around, do you do any broader analysis with that broader set of data? So do you look up for any trends? What's the capability from the systems that we have to do any broader trend analysis? Because again, this is something that has been discussed in the media relatively recently around kind of the looking at for themes, for trends, etc. So I'm just really keen to kind of get your perspective on, beyond each individual case, for which we absolutely understand now the rationale, why it's there and how that's managed. Is there any kind of wider use of the data more systemically?
So we've started to look at themes and demographics contained within the data, and I think to your point, Katharina, it's really important that we've got an understanding of what that means. Ultimately, this is about public safety. To your point, Mary, we have a duty and a responsibility to protect people, and the system and the sharing of the information allows us to be able to do that. But actually, is there something around the data that's contained within the system that would give us a better understanding of perhaps how we could work more in the prevention space, other agencies that we might need to work with more or less, as the case may be? That's definitely work that I think we need to undertake. We've started some demographic work to understand what's in the system, but I think there's more we can do with that, Katharina. And I suppose that's something that I think when we look at VPD in the context of COS and how we might move with that forward, that's something that I'm really keen to explore, so that we can really understand where the data is important for us and what we can use it for in the future. It's a really good point.
I suppose COS gives you an opportunity to do that you haven't had before, so that'd be helpful. Martin, I should have mentioned that you were joining us today. Apologies for not saying that, but it's good to have you with us. Did you want to come in now?
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me onto the committee. It was just to take Bex up on that offer of examples of the use value of the vulnerable persons database. I think it would help the board members very much if we could have specific examples about the successful use of the data in terms of the safeguarding. I think it'd also be useful to have examples of where somebody's on and then you have decided it's inappropriate they're on. So we know we can give life to this idea that you're taking people off appropriately. But my main concern is with 900,000 people on the database, with your safeguarding duties within the statutory framework of wellbeing, and you well described it there, which I thought was very useful. You then say, here's how we gave real life to that wellbeing duty using this very significant data holding that you have. So I'd be grateful for that. And can I ask you to do that through ARAC, and maybe ARAC can then brief the board about these examples? That'd be, if that's okay with you, Mary.
Yes, of course. Yes, no, I think that would be really helpful. Bex, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I can absolutely do that. I can give you some sort of case studies in terms of different individuals that we've safeguarded as a result of sharing information through Bernardo's or Assist or whatever that might be, and kind of take you through that. Absolutely. Perhaps that would be something that would be useful alongside some of the other pieces in terms of taking you through the consent, the information sharing, the other bits that I think might be helpful as well. I can absolutely do that, either bring that back to another of these or a different session.
Okay, yeah, well, we'll have a discussion about how and when we do that, but I think we would find that extremely helpful. And, you know, potentially the discussion in public is what's important here, so that, you know, not only do we understand this better, but everybody else does as well. I think that'd be, keep that in mind when we're making the arrangements for the discussion. So, moving on, perhaps, is there anybody else wants to come in with anything about the report or any of the issues associated with it? Grant. Oh, sorry, you're on mute, Grant.
Sorry, the first time I've done that today.
I know. One of us was bound to do it.
Sorry. I know it's a sort of segue into other use of data for other things, but you know, there's been an awful lot of publicity about in the last, well, this month really, about hate crime, and I'm thinking in terms of whilst an awful lot of this appears to be anonymous, and you obviously have difficulty following things up, is there any possibility of there being somebody phoning up anonymously or otherwise to record a sort of incident that concerns them that might interact with vulnerable persons, that you could end up getting some form of information that would then lead to putting somebody on the database for vulnerable persons as a result of a complaint or an anonymous comment or whatever. I'm just trying to sort of see how it all fits together, if there is in fact any crossover.
I'll pick that one up, Grant. So firstly, the reporting of hate crime comes in different guises, whether that's via telephone, through the C3 contact us email, or the online portal. So first and foremost, every single report that we receive, whether anonymous or not, is assessed on a case-by-case basis. And as a consequence of that, we're taking a course of action to create an incident, to follow that up, to progress some form of investigation. So that initial assessment based on the anonymity of a report would still be considered. And if there's a line of inquiry that requires a degree of investigation, then we would undertake that. So whilst a large proportion of those anonymous reports will not necessarily result in a hate crime or a no crime hate incident, everyone is assessed on a case-by-case basis, whether it's a verbal phone call into C3 or whether it's an online report. So notwithstanding it's anonymous, if there's a line of investigation or further work that we would undertake, then we would absolutely do that. We don't draw a line under a report simply because it's initially reported to us anonymously.
No, so it is possible that depending on how you assess something, that could lead to somebody's name being put on the vulnerable persons database at that point in time.
No, sorry.
If appropriate.
No, it wouldn't. It could lead to us following a line of investigation. So, I mean, vulnerable persons database is all about the vulnerability of the perceived victim or the reporter. So, an anonymous report could be a scenario where I'm reporting on behalf of Beck Smith, who I would consider to be vulnerable and perhaps the subject of a hate crime. So the investigation would potentially take us to speak to Beck Smith, and only after we're progressing that investigation would that be a consideration.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for clarifying that. Thank you.
So the data wouldn't be recorded just because somebody had brought the complaint to you or made you aware of it. It would only be if it was appropriate after some investigation.
Absolutely, that would be the case, Mary, in any set of circumstances, we wouldn't anticipate any occasions when C3 staff would routinely create an IVPD based on a phone call or online report, with some form of follow-up work on behalf of Police Scotland.
Okay, that's helpful.
Clear.
And in terms of what you've been doing over the last couple of weeks, when you've been receiving complaints in initially very large numbers, would you be able to confirm that there haven't been details recorded in terms of the subject person on this system, just as a matter of course?
Yeah, so our guidance would be really clear that we would now talk about the other party or the third party, and our guidance is really clear that there's no set of circumstances where we should be recording routinely third party information. What's also really interesting, and you've all seen it from the data, that given the huge proportion of online reports that we have received, a small number of those reports have resulted in a crime, and an even smaller number of those reports has resulted in a no crime hate incident. So in the first couple of weeks, we have a close level of scrutiny on both systems.
And could you say something specifically about that issue of the non-hate crime, or the non-crime hate reports rather, and what would be recorded routinely from those?
So it really builds on the comments that Bex has made. The rationale for us creating a no crime hate incident is all about the vulnerability of the reporter or the perceived victim, and the purpose of creating a no crime hate incident is, as we go forward, that allows us to ensure that the support and response that we give to that person within the community is well received. So there is no threshold for what would reach the level of it's not a crime, but it might be a no crime hate incident. The threshold around that is all focused on the vulnerability of the reporter in those circumstances.
Okay, that's helpful. Anybody got any other questions on this issue? Katharina.
I was on mute, sorry. No, just following on, Mary, from your line of inquiry, since we are going down this route, what we have been told by Scottish Government, less so by Police Scotland primarily, is that the recording of non-crime hate incidents is important because it enables Police Scotland to monitor community tensions, I think was the phrase that was used quite widely. Could you maybe just, but what we are hearing just now is that the recording of these is more person specific and more focused on vulnerability, which I think everybody will understand why that is a positive thing to do. But how do we reconcile this very much individual focused reporting and recording with the statement that the broader data is used to monitor community tensions?
Apologies, I was switching off my camera rather than switching off mute, so I can't really comment on behalf of some of the comments that have been made by Scottish Government. But what I can say largely is there's two purposes to us recording information in IVPD. One, it does help us with some statistical information. In the same way as we would disaggregate the actual crime data, and I think the crime data is actually much more valuable in terms of looking at the impact on local communities. So I could tell you right now, in the first 2 weeks of this year, and in terms of legislation, where across Scotland is the predominant levels of crime, what characteristics of those crimes are, and actually the data that I published to the SPA and to Scottish Government on Monday shows that we still maintain the same pattern over the course of 5 years. But to the second point, Katharina, it's absolutely about the vulnerability of the individual. And you know, with the new legislation, we could have someday in Glasgow reporting what they perceive to be a hate crime in Edinburgh. So I don't believe that we can draw a lot from the database that helps us specifically around community tensions. There's many other tools that we would use to look at the impact on local communities.
Helpful, thank you.
Thank you. So I think Alan, to summarise what you're saying, that there is clear consideration of what is the policing purpose of recording the data before any record is created, and that would apply to non-crime hate reports as well. And you wouldn't be recording information about the subject routinely. Is that fair?
That's absolutely correct.
I think that's helpful. If there are no other questions, I'm afraid, Claire, we've kind of strayed a wee bit from the substance of your audit report, but these are matters of significant public interest at the moment, and I think it's really helpful to have a discussion about them in public and to get the reassurances that both Bex and Alan have been able to give us. But if we're content with that discussion on this particular item, so again, thank you for that report, and we'll move on to your next report, which was on investment prioritisation. Entirely different.
Yeah, so this review covers the investment governance framework and the processes around developing, monitoring and reforecasting the annual budget. Again, we've given limited assurance over design and operational effectiveness of the controls in this area, whilst we found that the budget setting process was really well understood and well controlled. We thought the investment prioritisation process was lacking in transparency over decision making and lacking in having clear prioritisation criteria for investments. Essentially, the main decision on investment prioritisation is made at the Capital Investment Group, which then proposes the annual capital and transformation spend programmes for approval to the Corporate Finance and People Board and at the SPA during the budget development process. However, at the Capital Investment Group, there's no formal minutes taken, and actions and notes from the meeting are inconsistently prepared at each meeting. So we weren't able to identify and assess the consistent application of any investment prioritisation considerations or fully understand the rationale for decision making by the Capital Investment Group. We did note during our work that a lot of impact analysis is done at individual project level, so benefits, risks, costs, interdependencies for every project is considered at that level. And within some areas of the organisation, they'll do that in aggregate for the areas under their control. It's just when it gets to the Capital Investment Group level that it becomes unclear how decisions have been made. So we feel there's a risk there that there could be ineffective assessments being carried out, or the investments that are taken forward may not be the most beneficial investments for the police to take forward. There is an investment governance framework in place, and it covers a clear process for proposing, reviewing and approving business cases, but again, doesn't cover a process for prioritisation. We've also raised findings around record keeping on investment project approvals, as in all of the cases that we selected for review, there wasn't full and complete evidence of every step of the process being fully approved at each stage required by the policy. So we recommended that the frameworks updated, the frameworks more consistently applied, and also that training on prioritisation is rolled out after the framework's been updated to include that. Projects and change will be a key area of risk for Police Scotland going forward in the context of the challenging objectives they're setting and the tight resources they have. So I feel it's important that these areas are improved, but we are pleased to note that all the recommendations have been accepted and agreed by management.
Thank you, Claire. I think that's very helpful. The last point, particularly, so that your recommendations have been accepted by management and will now be being actioned. So that's good to know. I mean, clearly, it's important that we have an understanding or better understanding of how investment decisions are reached, because they have such an impact on the revenue budget as well, for example. So given the tight resources we have, it's important that we know we're spending the capital, which is never enough, but we're spending it wisely and we're spending it well. So pass over to Grant.
Thanks, Mary, and Claire. as you know, I think I'm chair of the Resources Committee and member of the Budget Working Group. Certainly, I found this report extremely helpful. Thank you very much indeed. One of the things that I'm very conscious of, and I know Patrick, who's on the screen, will be aware of the question having come several times, when we come to, there's obviously much more in the way of requests for spend on capital and revenue than the resources are possibly available. So the whole question of prioritisation is something we've been asking about a number of times. And one of the things we wanted to be absolutely sure about was, with all the different bids flying around, how the prioritisation worked, and was there complete agreement at the senior leadership team in Police Scotland that the actual order of prioritisation and the next tier coming behind had been completely agreed at that level. And we were assured about that, but certainly we hadn't gone into the detail about how much evidence there was to support the discussion. So your recommendations here, I think, are extremely pertinent, and thank you very much indeed. And I am also reassured that all the recommendations have been accepted. So I'm sure these will be flowing through into the 2024-25 budget preparation round and approval. Thank you very much.
Yes, anything which makes an opaque process more transparent is to be welcomed. So I think your report will go a long way towards helping that. Patrick, did you wish to say anything at this stage?
Thank you, Chair. No, just at this stage, I think we do recognise particularly kind of the lack of transparency, mainly just around the kind of governance of the minutes, and we have particularly strengthened that, and I hope Mr McRae can attest to that in terms of the assurance and the deep dives that we have done on capital. But even if we can make it more transparent, as he indicates, that's what we intend to do. Although we have kind of accepted all the recommendations to further explore, I think the one that I am struggling with the most is the value on making investment prioritisation training mandatory. And I think it goes to some of the points that the committee have already made, is this type of training is not relevant for everyone because the capital spend is quite limited to a couple of business areas. So I don't think it would be rolling out mandatory training to everyone, but ensuring that clarity is provided and training is provided to those core budget holders who hold capital, which is very limited to senior kind of executive members who own that portfolio and are part of that capital investment group. We will continue to explore it, but at this point I'm not anticipating we would make that mandatory, but we will explore it by the suggested completion date of the end of Q1, because that will also take us to get some evidence about how the changes we made for this budget setting round is taking effect on prioritisation through Q1 as we get the Q1 forecast as well. So just want to give you kind of a heads up that that's kind of the position we are looking at present. But thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Yeah. Anybody got any other questions or comments on this? Oh, I think something would happen to my screen there. Nothing else? Well, again, then thank you, Claire, for the report. Very, very helpful, particularly for Resources Committee members and the Resource Budget Group. So the final report from you today, final audit report from you today, is on the Middle Office Restructure Project. It's a slightly unusual type of audit, but I think, happy to have you present that to us. Thank you.
Great. So the Force Middle Office Reform project work has been carried out to provide greater visibility and understanding of what happened with this project and identify any learning opportunities that we can apply to future projects. As such, there's no assurance opinion on this work as it was more advisory in nature. I guess our overall observation was that the project was initially scoped well. There was a clearly defined roadmap for successful delivery, sufficient buy-in from divisions, good communication practices there, and the resources to bring the project forward were approved, and all of the kind of governance around that stage of it was very clear. However, as the project began to progress, the approved resource was never recruited and the project wasn't delivered to expectations. What we're told is that that was due to it being deprioritised due to resource constraints. However, we can't find any evidence to validate what the rationale for this decision was. Ultimately, executing this review was really challenging due to a lack of sufficient audit trail and evidence of decision making, a lack of transparency. There was no formal sign-off of project closure, we had to rely on representations from stakeholders that the project was closed, it was not progressing. So we've raised a number of recommendations around the effectiveness of this approach to project management, and some of those relate to things like the project close procedures, which should have been followed as per the stage gate framework in place at the time, formalisation of the resourcing requirement decision-making process and the processes for making sure that resources agreed are actually secured, escalation of resourcing issues during the project. We've also noted that there was no real process in place to track objectives and benefits of the project through its life cycle and the costs of the project through its life cycle to keep track of whether it was actually delivering. The project ran for around 30 months, and it didn't seem like at any point there was really ongoing financial assessments carried out around how much it was costing, what savings it was making, what benefits it was achieving. And that's not to say that it didn't achieve those benefits. It's just the evidencing of the impact of the project wasn't there from inception right up. From inception it was, but actually during that delivery phase that was running for around 30 months, there was no tracking. We have discussed these findings with Police Scotland, who recognised the findings in this report. However, given it is a historic project, feel it's not reflective of the robust project management controls in place at this point. So it's agreed that there's no recommendations within this report that need to be taken forward at this time. However, within the 2024-25 audit plan, we have a wider review of project management. So during that review, we will consider if the issues highlighted within this report extend wider or have, as Police Scotland have suggested, already been addressed, and we'll be able to provide assurance over that at that stage.
Thank you very much, Claire. This is very helpful. It's a project we're all familiar with and we've all had some concerns about, but your report is useful, and particularly looking forward to the review that you're going to do in the next financial year. I think that would be important. Before I open it up to members, I wondered if, Andrew, you wanted to come in at this stage?
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I'll be very brief. I mean, the management response is there. I think, this is a kind of lessons learned in how some activity can end up in the space it's in. I mean, it wasn't under formal control, which is why in a lot of cases it doesn't really map to formal control questions. But as I said, the management response outlines that, and we are confident that what we've got in place for our project deliveries will obviously go through that review positively. But yeah, it was interesting to get the kind of lessons learned from this, and it's something that I'm using actively in regards to how we're shaping the portfolio going forward. So I appreciate the work. Thank you.
And I think it'd be helpful that, as you say, you're picking up the lessons learned, and future projects will be managed differently, and the evidence will be there for everybody to see. But could you give us some sort of assurance as to whether or not this project was really an exception and not something that was more widely happening in the last year or two?
Yeah, Chair, it is an exception. I mean, this is a project that wasn't a project, if you like. It was something that people were interested in progressing and kind of reviewing. It was chopped up, it was moved around. It was, we never had a formal business case really for this. It was something people were spending a bit of time on looking at, but not necessarily, it wasn't being managed, I suppose. So from my perspective, it isn't representative of the rest of the portfolio because it wasn't really part of it. But again, there's lessons to be learned there in regards to how far activity like that should be allowed to go. I mean, as I said, there wasn't much commitment of funds to it or resource, if any, really. It was kind of being done by the business areas themselves, and there was a kind of belief that at some point it got to a level, it would then move into formal change. So I think, to your point and the point I made at the start, I think this is lessons learned as to that, that isn't an approach that we should be taking for any bit of work, really. And as I said, I think we can demonstrate from our formal change mechanisms that isn't the norm, and that this was really probably a bit of a tactical activity that kind of went on too long. And again, I think the report kind of pulls that out. So.
Okay, thank you. Open it up to members for questions. Grant. And then Katerina, you both came on there at exactly the same time.
Well, this case, we both come on at the same time. I'll let Katerina go first.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. I mean, to be honest, Mary, you've kind of covered the questions I had around is, to what degree is this an exception? So I think it's really good, and that there's assurance that Andrew provided there is really good as well. just an observation from my side is exactly, even though there wasn't a lot of resource allocated, and that's again reassuring, Andrew, there's always an opportunity cost, even if it's just, you know, staff doing things that they could be spending time on something else. So, you know, so I think everybody acknowledges this, and I think it's really helpful to see it. Yeah, and the other question, actually, probably a bit more critically for our SPA colleagues as well, is because I know obviously our officers are much closer aligned to a lot of the change activity that happens in Police Scotland as well. So, so just maybe a question for us as well, as if to what degree were we aware that this non-project kind of project was happening, etc. You know, and is there something where we maybe could have, you know, potentially been a bit more proactive in our own challenge and actually saying, look, why is this where it is? I don't know the background to this, but again, you know, I'm just acutely aware of the opportunity cost, and considering, and everybody's agreeing, I think, around the table here. So, you know, considering the environment into which we're moving in terms of resource constraints, etc., we just need to be super mindful, even of sort of minutes of our people's time spent on the activities that we've, you know, prioritized and agreed. So I think everybody is agreeing here, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Grant.
Thanks, Mary. Two points really. One is, are we able to confirm that there are no other projects that are sort of have started and are sort of drifted, shall we say? Because I think it would be quite useful to be sure that someone has got an oversight of that, to be sure there's nothing else in this category. The second point was that I seem to remember DCO Page talking about the merits of this review to try and identify what FMOR might save if revised right across the organisation. So accepting that this particular project hasn't been developed, I just wonder if there's something alternative that is being planned to look at the way in which the FMOR, sorry, that acronym, could actually be tried and tested in another way that might actually identify whether there is actually scope to release some savings or reallocation of resources that would benefit the entire organisation.
Andrew, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Thanks, Grant, Katrina. So I can answer kind of both points there. So first, I mean, this was BAU activity that kind of moved into maybe a slightly more formal space. So as to kind of assuring that activity like this isn't going on, I can certainly assure that nothing of this level of scale, etc., is going on. But what I would say is there is naturally a bit of BAU transformation always going on, which again I think, you know, is actually quite healthy. But that is being managed and kind of overseen as part of that BAU space. But as soon as it gets into a more formal space where it is requiring dedicated spend, then obviously it would go through governance and prioritisation, etc. We did get a lot of value from this work, though. I wasn't here for the start of it. I know it was ACC Mears and others in local policing that kind of started off this activity, but this did start as a bit of a review of the kind of workforce, resource, etc. And all that work that was done has actually been used in other programmes like LPSDR, etc., which I know members are aware of. So that, you know, that has moved on and lived on into other activity. But I think the kind of the heading of FMOR, you know, really represented a range of discovery work that was going on, which, you know, was borderline BAU really. It just probably went on for a wee bit longer than it should have, and probably to members' points, we should have formalised that at a point in time. But I think that's happened now with a lot of that insight and data moving into other spaces. So I think it's that kind of definition of what is a project and what isn't, etc. But again, it's not for us to tie this meeting up in that, but just to assure everyone there isn't any sort of mass activity like this going on that I'm not comfortable with, if you like, or the organisation isn't comfortable with, kind of sits in that BAU space. So thank you.
Cool. Thank you for that assurance, Andrew. I mean, obviously, as you say, this was important work. You know, the restructuring of the middle office will have an important part to play in developing the new model of policing and living within our means. So could you tell us about how it's now being taken forward? Which project is it? Which formal project is it all part of now?
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, it's kind of made its way into various spaces. So I think part of the kind of review and redesign activity, which is going on across the organisation, both to deliver the future operating model, but also, you know, to kind of face off some of the financial challenges we've got, that insight around how local divisions are structured and how things are how things have been delivered, even, you know, internally and externally. You know, a lot of the insight has kind of came from the work in the FMLR space. And equally, that kind of mapping out our target and future operating model, having that insight of the current one is really important. I would also say that obviously during recent resource reviews that have happened over the last 12 months, officer numbers, etc., again, a lot of the decision making that had to be made in there, some of that came from some of the insights in here and kind of were informed by that. So, yeah, I would maybe surface that having a greater understanding of where resources are deployed and services are being delivered came from a lot of the work that was done here. And again, that's that kind of BAU aspect that then, you know, led to decision making elsewhere. So in a more formal basis, the local policing service delivery review work and also some of the more broader SCRR and review and redesign work, you know, will all have touch points into what was middle office, back office functions. So again, they'll benefit from some of the work that's been done there as well. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Chris, you wanted to come in.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of things. First, I just wanted to address Katrina's point directly, if I may, which is the SPA's role in sort of picking up on non-projects and some of this activity. So obviously, first time around, this wasn't something that was directly on our radar because of it not having a project status. It didn't enter the governance process. So to some extent, you know, we don't necessarily have eyes on all of these things. So it's good to hear Andrew's assurance about how this will be taken forward, and there'll be a lot more discipline around this. So we're happy with that. But obviously, off the back of this review, we do need to be extra vigilant, and I'm sure working with Andrew, we can do that. The second point is that I would see probably some read across between this and the prioritisation discussion from the previous report as well. So, you know, where there is organisational bandwidth being used on projects that have not really been approved or gone through the formal process, one can only assume that other projects are being deprioritised, consciously or otherwise. And I think as we go into this next phase of changing how critical it is under Andrew's leadership, you know, again, we'll just have to be really careful that that discipline and that control is there. So I think, you know, in terms of the development points from both of these audits, they're actually quite complementary, and it's reassuring to hear kind of what Andrew's mindset is, I think, going into this. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That's really good. And the value of the audit then, Claire, is very much recognised by the committee. So thank you again for that. Thank you for all three reports today. I think we're probably finished questioning on these, in which case the public part of the business is now completed, and we'll just take a short pause to allow the live stream to end, and then we have a very, very short standing item in relation to the approval of a minute. So if you could just bear